Waiting for Stan to connect. Stan, you should see me there now. Okay, a little dead air here, guys. I remember way back in, gosh, when was it? 1930 when I was, no, just kidding. Way back in 79, I guess, when I was doing my little DJ thing at the WSIE FM, the Southern Illinois University Edwardsville radio station. And this was one thing you could not do. You could not have dead air. That was me channeling Christoph Clugston there for just a second. The way I said that. So I'm waiting for Stan to connect here. I don't know what the problem is, though. We've been, this is our third one, and they've been pretty easy so far for us to connect. So I'm not sure what's going on his end. Okay, he said he doesn't see me. So hang on one second. I invited you to join the talk. That invite should be there. You have to click on it. So anyway, Stan's having a little technical difficulty. I seem to be cruising right along here. So we'll give him a few more minutes and hopefully this works out. Like I said, we haven't had trouble in the past. So yeah, so anyway, dead air. Yes, I'm obviously filling time because we're having an issue today. But all right. What can I say? Oh, well, some of you guys that have been looking at these are obviously people who are kind of following me on YouTube a little bit, and some of those people following me are also folks that probably are only looking at these talks due to the fact that they have seen some of the talks I've done with Christoph Clugston, us being a tiny portion of the original JKD or Jeet Kune Do martial art students under Mike Sandlin, Carl James, and Stan Brooks himself way back when, in the early 70s when I started, 73. So I was a bit surprised to see that a few of the guys that are following our martial talks and following me on Facebook on my martial art page, O'Neill Martial Systems, actually watched some of these talks, which I would not have thought were really necessarily something they'd be interested in, but I've had some positive feedback, so that's good. There's some open-minded people out there, so that's nice to see. For me, there's a very specific and a very direct connection between the two, which if I don't get to stand here in a minute, I'll go on with that. Give me just a second here. And I'm calling him, so this will be fun. It's like watching the old Patty Duke show. Most of you guys aren't even old enough to know what that was, but teenagers on the phone and watching teenagers on the phone on a TV program, and it's the silly things that they would say. So I don't know how silly this will be, but yeah, what's going on your end? Well, you've got to accept the invitation through Google Talks. You've got to get in your Google, and like we did before, and you got to accept my invite, and then everything will happen automatically. It's not going to happen if you're not in there. Open up your Google. Okay. So anyway, folks, while we're waiting for Stan, what I'll say is that along the subject of what I was just talking about, for me, this is all connected because Hey, Stan, I think you're getting there. There he is.
Okay.
Okay, guys, he's here. Yay. Everybody go yay, yay. All right. Hey, all this technology. You guys got to remember, all you young whippersnappers out there, that Stan and I might still be whippersnappers, but we're not as young, and all this technology stuff's a little newer for us. I had far more difficulties when I first started doing this with Mr. Christoph Clugston, who he doesn't realize it yet, but I have a new nickname for him, Clugsy. I like using nicknames. When I like people, they get a nickname. So we'll see how he reacts to that. Because this is gonna, when this goes on Facebook, he's gonna, it'll tag him, and then he's gonna be curious to see what I said about him. So anyway, it'll be good. And there's Stan. So with no further ado, Stan, why don't you go ahead and officially kick us off today, then, will you?
Okay. Well, feel free to jump in at any time.
Sure.
So basically, Ken and I are presenting the second talk, a continuation of what we did at the last session when we opened up the discussion about the causes of suffering. And we decided to continue because there's a lot of particulars and there's a lot of scenarios that we can bring up to kind of go into further depth and research this topic a little bit more, more deeper, and particularly bring up maybe even more of our personal experiences with our own suffering, because it's not something that's really exceptional at all. We're all human. We all have problems and challenges in life, and sometimes we get caught in a dump. So it's kind of good to bring up some of the things that we've experienced ourselves. But what we customarily do, and the reason why we generally start off with the meditation, is, again, this total presentation that we do every month is based on metaphysics. So whenever you're researching spirituality or metaphysics, meditation is a very strong component. So we like to begin with just a brief 30-second to 1 minute meditation. And we like to ask everyone just to clear their mind. If you want to focus on the topic of the day, that's fine. But basically, you relax and clear your mind. So this way, we're a little bit more receptive and we're a little bit more creative, hopefully, in our presentation. So why don't we start off with just a very brief 30-second meditation, please. Okay, ready and begin. All right, finished? Okay, Ken, would you like to jump in? And
yeah, well, one thing I guess I should finish, that I was kind of covering our little dead airspace there for a while, and I was telling the guys that I said this is funny because in '79, when I was back at SIU and I was working on a degree in TV and radio production and instructional applications of electronic media before anybody hardly saw much of that, one of the big no-nos was dead air, on the radio. So I was talking about that, but then more interestingly, something I've noticed here is that some of the people that are watching these are folks that notice them just because they're following me on YouTube now somewhat. And that's due to the stuff I was doing with Clugsy. I had to say it again. So I want to embed this in his psyche so he'll accept my lovable nickname for the guy. Anyway, but what I was starting to say right before you came on was that there's a deep connection between how we met through the JKD and the martial art training and what we're doing now. For me, and I know for you too, they're not two separate things, So I'm really not so surprised that some of the guys that were probably curious, oh, what are these two old JKD guys going to talk about in these talks on metaphysics? What's that got to do with it? But I'm getting good feedback, and some of these guys are watching these things, and it shows me that some folks have pretty open minds out there, which tells us a lot, And I think that it's it's good, even if you don't agree with things that we say. Hopefully, if nothing else, what it will do is stimulate you to be more open in how you relate to any other people that don't do what you do, that don't practice the way you practice, you know. So I wanted to mention that, and maybe we'll have maybe in another talk, because this came to me just while I was sitting there waiting for you to get on. We probably could do a really good talk or two just on what my statement meant when I said that the martial art training and the spiritual path for Stan and I have been synonymous, and they've evolved dramatically, dramatically for both of us. I think it's kind of classic when you read old literature about what happens to people that reach, let's at least say, advanced levels within their martial training, how something based on the idea of fear of physical death in combat can turn into something spiritual. Well, if you have trouble with that, let me frame it this way for you, for food for thought. If you're afraid, that tends to make you aggressive. When you're afraid in some kind of altercation with another person or people, the natural thing to do is to get aggressive. Aggression doesn't necessarily mean something bad. You may have to make physical aggressive movements to get yourself out of a situation, but they don't necessarily have to be violent, or at least not very violent. So what's the big fear there that causes all this? The big fear is the fear of death. Okay. So when you meditate on your own fear of death and you work through the processes, realistically enacting scenarios whereby you may die at the hand of another person, that is a study in fear, and it's particularly a study of fear of severe injury and death. Well, death is a major component for most people in their spiritual pursuit. What happens to me after I die? So leaving it right there at this point, because this is another whole talk for another day, I just wanted to basically at least not leave you hanging, because I made that statement right before Stan came on. I'm thinking Stan would agree that we could probably do another talk or two on our general subject matter related to that, since so many of you guys that have initially started watching this are also martial artists. That having been said, back to you.
Yeah, you know what, Ken, that would be an excellent topic of the relationship of martial arts to spirituality, because there's a definite link. And I believe, from what I remember years ago, when Bruce was playing Kato in the Green Hornet program, someone, and I don't know in what context this was given, but they asked him what would be the next step in human evolution. And without hesitation, he said spirituality. And you could see just from Bruce Lee's movement how intense his energy was. That he was drawing energy not just from the physical or the mental plane. I believe he was drawing energy from a much higher plane. So that's our next step, so we can grow out of the competition and the conflict mode, which leads to warfare and so forth, and also to a direct confrontation of death. So the irony is that we actually create our own demons. We're afraid of death, but yet we create the scenarios that lead directly to death. So it's kind of a funny catch-22 the humans are in. But pertaining to today's topic, the causes of suffering, I've been giving it a lot of thought for the past several weeks. And I like to draw sort of like an analogy between physical pain and emotional pain. And on physical pain, all the scientists and doctors tell us pain is basically a neurological warning system. It's letting us know that there's something going on with our body. Now, if it's minor, let's say you stub a toe or you jam a finger, you can kind of rub it off, okay? And then you resolve that pain. But if it's a little bit deeper, then we know we have to go to a doctor, and we need to go to an examination, find out what the problem is. So with the analogy of that to emotional pain, it's the same thing. Sometimes someone may give you a slight, a disregard, or you may get frustrated from a relationship, and it's something you can kind of brush off. But a lot of times it runs deeper than that. So it can be the same component that's happening, in terms of physical pain. That is, when we suffer, when we cling to emotional pain, it's a warning system. It's telling us that there's something deeper going on, and we need to go into that and find out what it is. Now, since a lot of us can afford analysts and psychiatrists, we have to sort of be our own physician in that way. So this is why I believe the meditation is a very strong tool, because it allows you to reflect, to contemplate, to go into yourself, to find out, okay, why am I suffering in this way? How come I haven't been able to get over this emotional pain? So I like to use that analogy, sort of like a format that we could draw from. And I think one of the interesting things about human nature is that a lot of times when we become alienated, we become isolated, it really becomes more, it really enhances the situation. It makes things so much worse because we think that we're the only ones. So with Ken and I, we've talked about this, so many times. We're not here as authority figures. We're just here to share what we've experienced, the things that have worked for us, and hopefully it can lead someone else to find their own solutions. Okay, that's just the bottom line of all the philosophy of these talks. So I like to just bring that into the fact that when we have the suffering, you should avoid that mindset. Oh, I'm alone. Why am I being persecuted? Believe it, you're not the only one that's going through. No matter how worse the situation is, you're not the only one. Sometimes if you're able to get out, if you have close friends or family members, or if you can just read, sometimes it'll draw inspiration from what other people have gone through. And I've had teachers to tell us that sometimes when you, on a scale of 1 to 10, you're at, let's say, a 6, and you really think that you're in the worst situation, and you run across somebody that's at a 7, 8, or 9, then it helps you to appreciate what you're going through. So it sort of balances that situation. It gives you a more cleaner or a more balanced perspective of what you're going through. That others have gone through just as bad a situation, if not worse. Okay, Ken, any?
Yeah. That's good. That's right on the money. I mean, I think well, in the realm of therapy, and Stan and I both spent a lot of time studying psych, and he was graduating about the time I was just really getting going. I was a double major in psych and philosophy initially, and spent my first 4 years doing that. And Stan did the same thing. And just going to the psychological model, in our culture. I mean, this is, and getting into addictions and problems of all kinds. I mean, this is the idea of support group, right? Doing group, as they used to say. So for people that aren't in a formal process like that, or like Stan said, can't afford it, or maybe they're just going through, I hate to use the word normal, but more like, let's just say most people go through a lot of ups and downs, like Stan said earlier, right? So having an inadvertent support group, which may be just listening to us talk, although however soon we'll be opening this up and people can join us in real time live, and we can talk about these things. We're not necessarily trying to turn this into some kind of inadvertent group therapeutic thing, although that may happen for you inadvertently. But just letting you know that you're not the only ones out there that have had some suffering in their lives, and I'm sure we'll be willing, as this goes, to share some pretty personal stuff, so that you can realize we're not just here going blah blah blah, but this is real life, usable information. A lot of what we're going to give out, it's when you see the word metaphysical in the tagline for some of the talks, it's not meant to think that we're going to sit here and just do esoteric conversations on subjects that have no practical use. To us, practical use and our metaphysical beliefs are synonymous, just like they are with our martial art backgrounds and where that's led us and where that's still continuing to take us. Okay, so that's, I guess, how I would frame it.
Yeah, and in that, it has a lot of practicality, in that if it resonates with you, and that is the information that, we bring up, if it seems to have any kind of validity for what you're experiencing, then you go with that. And the old phrase, remember, it says, how is that working for you? So that means you never know what the outcome will be. You try it and you see it. And if it doesn't work, then you make adjustments. Okay. And I think the most important thing is that not only do you learn, but the people who are closest to you that you share with, they're also learning. Because you'll find out that a lot of these situations people are experiencing in parallel. There may be differences, but in some cases, there are even more similarities. So we're not the only ones. This is what they refer to as, I think, synchronicity, when a person may have a particular insight or whatever, and then sure enough, it expands out to the group, and then they share it, and they find out that they're getting information, uh, in parallel, almost simultaneously. So again, we need to avoid that mental perspective of I'm alone. Why am I being persecuted? So that way we can keep our sight clear and we can look into the situation clearly. Another component I'd like to bring up is that a lot of times, because we're emotional creatures, right? So we like to hide our emotional pain, our suffering, particularly for others, because we always want to put ourselves in the most positive light. Well, that's okay. And it is very difficult to be really frank and open with everyone because anyone can be easily embarrassed, and it's hard, like I said, open up and bear your feelings. But I believe one thing that's very important, that is we shouldn't hide from ourselves, because sometimes if you're in a habit of hiding from others, sometimes you'll end up hiding from yourself. So that just compounds the problem. You're not even honest with yourself. So that's why Ken and I, we spoke about this before. We've had a lot of spiritual teachers who say, hey, you need to always call time out for you. Sit down, contemplate, think about how you feel about the situation, how you feel about this person. So it opens up the door so that you can clearly see what needs to be done. So it's very important for us to be very honest with ourselves. If not more so with others, but at least with ourselves, to be 100% honest and open.
No, that's good. This ties right in with the whole title of today is causes of self-suffering. Continuing from what we were saying before. The reason I suggested that this whole general topic is this is to me at the core of what holds us back from getting what we desire. I spent many years sitting on the cushion, formally and informally, with the Missouri Zen Center, and then a little while with the Vipassana group here in St. Louis. But one of the big problems that I ran into as a general tenet within Buddhism is that suffering is caused by desire. And I used to just set that one aside because I never really fully believed that. I found other benefits, particularly in Zazen practice. However, I agree that suffering is caused by desire, but at the same time, I'm 1,000% convinced that the way to end suffering is through the desire to end suffering. And there are very specific ways that you can do that, because we have to go back and remember something, that this is one of the things Stan and I agree on, is you create your own reality. Now, I've been having some fairly halfway intense conversations with another dear, super close, long-term friend of mine who's a PhD psychologist. Literally, we were doing this just this past Friday night. He's a former JKD student of mine and one of my dearest friends, and we clash on all this. A lot of people say, well, how can I be creating my own reality? How can I create my own suffering? And I say, well, without getting into an 8-hour intensive workshop, how about this? Think of it this way. If you closely watch the events that unfold in your life day by day, pay attention to them, do some journaling at the end of the day. Remember Doogie Howser, MD, the 10-year-old genius surgeon who, at the end of every episode, here's Doogie, man, on his old computer, and he's typing away, what happened in his day and what he learned from it. Well, that was good to throw that message out to people. That's a good thing to do. You've got to, like Stan said, you got to reflect, which is, meditation is a deep version of self-reflection. If you watch what happens to you, connect the events of your day to the thoughts that you've had throughout the day that led up to these events, and journal this every day, and then go back at the end of a month and connect your thought processes and groups of thoughts, which actually become your beliefs, And look how they led up to the events that you experience day to day. And then you're more likely to believe my statement that your thoughts create your reality. Thereby, your suffering is created by your thoughts. All right? If you catch yourself having a lot of negative thoughts about, one of the biggest frequently is health. All right? A lot of people go, I know people that are hardcore vegans, and they take every supplement on planet Earth. They filter all their water. They do IAQ, which is internal air quality studies in their homes. They run the air in their furnace through ultraviolet light to kill every micro. I know people that go to extreme lengths to stay healthy, and some of them are the most unhealthy people I ever run across. Now, why is that? Okay, how about this? Overly focusing on staying healthy, watch how you think about it, because you may have so many negative thoughts in general that, I'm so afraid of being unhealthy or being sick that I'm so focused on disease or the state of not being healthy that even though I'm doing these actions that you would think would make me healthy, if they're coming from a place of overly focused, negative, fearful thoughts, they create the opposite of what they think they would create. If you can follow that, because this is a pattern that people fall into all the time and they don't understand. Even people that do self-suggestion work to say, you know what, I'm tired of suffering in this terrible relationship I'm in. I'm tired of suffering from this health problem. And if they look at their own language, I've even seen where people will write on their note cards or whatever who do self-suggestion work. The language is so negative that they're actually creating the opposite energetic effect of what they're trying to get rid of, and they're making themselves sicker. So see, you have to be careful in how you even form your thoughts on subjects. You have to make it affirmative and positive so that you don't self-sabotage. And that's the phrase that's often used. Don't sabotage yourself. So in a nutshell, for me, the best way to end your self-suffering is I would say the first phase is watch what you're thinking. Note how your thoughts lead to events that you can track. And if you do this on a daily basis, it's fairly easy to remember, right? See what events you create and take specific things like, what events did I create today at work? And then say, subpart is, how did anything that happened today that wasn't comfortable for me, how did that make me suffer? Or maybe how is that somehow making people I'm interacting with at work suffer? How is that coming about? What's the thought process that led to all this? Okay. And then do that with your most key relationship, the closest person to you that you deal with on a daily or almost daily basis. What's going on there? Emotional, like Stan said, emotional suffering. Looking at patterns that you create throughout your day-to-day life that seem to repeat over and over and over and over again. And if you keep going back to the thoughts in the groups of thoughts, which are your beliefs, and they're not, Stan said it earlier, if it's not working for you, it's time to change it. And the good news is, and I can be a major testimonial poster child for this, you can change things that you would have never, ever, ever believed when you were younger that you could possibly ever change. And maybe even within this talk, I'll get to some of that for me. And if not, I'll do it in a future talk. But you got to start somewhere. And I posit that this is a great place to start. What do you think, Stan?
Oh, yeah, I think that's right on the money because, from the teachers that we've had, and I've always give so much gratitude to the teachers that I've had because, this is where we draw our knowledge and also our ability to discern as well. It's not like you have a teacher and you accept everything 100%, because a good teacher will actually lead you and guide you to where you find your own truth, because it comes from experience. The bottom line, you can gather all information that you possibly can. Matter of fact, we're living in an age where we have what you would call an oversaturation of information. So people can't really discriminate between knowledge, information, and understanding. They get them all confused because there's so much information available. But again, a good teacher will guide you so that you gain experience and you learn from that experience. But our thoughts are very powerful because our thoughts are like the energy that we project to actually create our daily reality. And I think a good part of this to keep in mind is that we have an individual consciousness, but we also have a collective consciousness. So right now, since we're going through this transition, this paradigm shift, there's a lot of purification and cleansing being done. So there's a lot of negative thoughts that are permeating the whole planet because this is part of the cleansing process. So with the collective consciousness, with all this negativity, it's so easy to get drawn in. This is why, what Ken is suggesting is very good. You try to separate from that collective consciousness. Deal with your own consciousness because this is creating your own reality. Forget about the group consciousness.
Yes.
Deal with what you're dealing with directly and try to deal with it with a clear mind. This is why, again, contemplation, meditation is very essential. So that way you can navigate much better to find a resolution or a solution to whatever problem that you're dealing with. But like I said, the collective consciousness right now can lead to a lot of confusion, a lot of frustration, and just a lot of what you would call destructive tendencies because we're making the shift from a negative field to that of a positive field. And in this transition, it's a birthing process. So we know what pain a mother has to go through to give childbirth, right? So it's something like an analogy what we're going through as human evolution. Okay, as we go through human evolution, and we're going through this process of shifting to a higher consciousness. So again, try to separate yourself from the group consciousness. You can take advice, you can listen to people, but be very discerning, be very discriminating. Don't accept all this information coming to you. Try to separate and clearly look at what you're dealing with on an individual basis.
That's a big one. That's really important because think of how pertinent this is right now with all this stuff floating around about fake news. I think the internet is the single most powerful thing that's ever come along to eradicate over time, and I think it already has to a degree that someone could do this for a PhD study. Xenophobia or xenophobia, the fear of other peoples from other countries and other cultures. I'll tell you what, I have very interesting personal experiences with this the last few years. I deal with a bunch of properties around the University City, Missouri area that are packed with Washington University students here in St. Louis. And I recently heard that I think the Washington U student pop somewhere between 40 to 50% is a number thrown at me. I haven't never verified this. Are students from Asia, particularly China. And I have a lot of contact with these students because I help them find off-campus housing. And it's really cool in many ways because one of them is I had one of the biggest eye-opening experiences I had, and this is relevant to what we're talking about here, is a couple of girls who are coming here for graduate school from mainland China, who were, one in particular, when I started to speak to her the first day she arrived, I said, gosh, so you must have gotten here in high school and did your undergrad here. She goes, no, I just got here about 6 hours ago. And I said, how can your English be this good? She said, oh, we all start English. Most of us start in grade school these days. And then ones that knew we were going to end up going to school here eventually, we're in advanced conversation classes. The teachers in those classes were Chinese folks who came here and immersed in the culture and understand slang and taught us so much about how people deal day to day. And this kind of stuff would have been unheard of, not many decades ago. Now it's like it's commonplace. A lot of these kids show up here from other countries and they can operate quite well. They kind of understand our psyche. And they'd say that a lot of this they learned from the internet too, So the point being that on one level, you have things that happen with how media inflates and exacerbates negativity within mass events and mass consciousness that we all share in, and we all have energetic input into that. We all have energetic receiving of that, and Stan's very, very on the point with, you got to be very careful with that stuff. All right. On one hand, it's great how the world is getting more and more interdependent in ways that they consciously realize, and much more interconnected. But as Stan says, there's like a balance that has to happen. There's a purging, there's a purging of old, established, ridiculous, xenophobic, fears of other races and other cultures and other religions, and fear, because what is foreign to people, they tend to fear. Okay. So on one hand, what's happening in mass consciousness is an unheard of, unprecedented in history connecting of peoples who would never have even known they exist. If we just went back probably a decade for most people, or a little further, now the people are connecting on levels that were unthought of before. And this I think is one of the greatest hopes. It's going to help people stop the world level suffering, which is what leads to mega suffering events called wars and crazy international events, and all this terrorist nonsense that's going on, and all this junk that's created by fear. It comes back down to fear. Think of the levels of suffering that are being created by all that ridiculous nonsense that should have been purged. Do we really learn anything through history? I'm tending to think more that we learn how to repeat it. Not that it repeats itself, but we learn how to create the same crap over and over again, because a lot of people worship history. I don't. I say the best way to break that is don't focus on it. Don't glorify history so much. It's great that people band together and they broke through things and they were able to survive and all that stuff. But if you're not careful, if you glorify the past, you can help recreate the past over and over again, because it's still going on anyway. That's probably a topic for another day. But think of it this way, because this still ties into what we're saying. What our big quantum physics guys have come up with over the last few years is that our idea of time, that there's a past, a present, and a future, is really just a mind construct. In objective reality, it doesn't exist. And the way this is demonstrated and the way this is realized is that on a subatomic level, there's no such thing as past, present, and future. And there are experiments you can do with subatomic particles that you can repeat, and you can see the proof that there are particles that can exist in the past, present, and future simultaneously. So we're starting to understand our universe in a different way, and this has dramatic implications for the fact that there really is no past, and there really is no future, even in a sense. There's just a continuous ongoing present that has ripples and waves, and there's a creative process whereby these things are in a constant state of flux and evolution. They're not static. We tend to think that, oh yeah, but wait a minute, when I was 10 years old, I almost fell off a cliff riding my bike. Yep. But then the part of you that you're focused on right now didn't have that experience, right? Well, if you think of possible multi-dimensions and multi-universes, that part of you that almost fell off the cliff, there's a part of you that did. I know this sounds really crazy, but the reason I'm throwing this at you, which is total topics on their own, is because I want you to see how powerful imagination, thought, groups of thoughts as beliefs, are energy that actually create our moment-to-moment experiences. The more you can grasp that on a bigger level, which is what I just kind of in a nutshell try to throw at you, and the more you can practice with it on a day-to-day basis, hopefully what comes out of that is you will take responsibility for everything that you experience. You'll take responsibility for it because you're creating it. And you're co-creating the mass events on the planet with other people. So just like the little example I gave about creating your own suffering, you think you're healing yourself, but basically what you're doing is if you're thinking wrongly about how you're healing yourself, you're making yourself more ill. Well, guess what? Same thing with the thoughts that you send out. and the thoughts you receive. You have to be careful with all that, because you can be helping create a whole lot of other suffering thinking you're doing the opposite. Just like thinking if you're overly patriotic, our country's the best, we have to survive at all costs, we have to push our ideas, everybody else has to think the way we do, or they're inferior, and you can extrapolate, take this over, you can think of this racially too with all the crap that's going on. Man, I thought that jive was going to end back when we were kids in the 60s and 70s. We were way more racially, what's the word I'm looking for, Stan? We were more racially accepting in that time period than we are now as a group of citizens in the U.S. Now, there are examples of folks who have evolved. I mean, there's folks like us who didn't, who were with that, and we didn't go backwards in time. And there are people now that aren't like that, but at the same time, that stuff still exists, right? That stuff still exists and is still going on. And what does all this have to do with our talk? It's all about suffering. We're still creating suffering in ourselves and suffering in others. We're helping them create it because we're staying in these little loops. You have to get out of these loops. You have to get out of these loops, and you have to start, like Stan said, and like I said, you got to start with yourself. You have to practice. This is training. See, this is another good thing martial arts does for you. It teaches you, let's just say, self-discipline, for a better lack of words. You learn how to study, you learn how to practice, you learn how to stick to something and get results. You don't like the results, change them. You have complete power and energy to do that. Sorry, I got going, man. Off to you.
No, I'm going to go to because you went into a very deep metaphysical concept that ties in directly to quantum physics. But and by the way, those sciences, in terms of physics, they're opening up, and I'd just like to, let everyone know that people already know this. There's many scientists, specialists within the field, particularly quantum physics, is very adept at translating in layman's term what their discoveries are. So it ties in directly into how we're using energy, how we project energy, and how we receive energy, because everything can be looked at in terms of the energetic model. So in this way, we come out of ourselves. But what I'd really like to mention too is that it's important of what self-image that we have. Because like I said, with all the collective consciousness being so submerged in negative thought right now, it's very easy to have a negative self-image. So we want to reflect and say, how do I see myself? Do I see myself as a productive person? Do I see myself as basically a good person, someone who wants to share, to contribute for the benefit of humankind, or if not to the benefit of my family, my community? But what is your self-image? Because a lot is drawn from that. So again, we want to separate from that type of collective consciousness that's out there that's telling us. One of the most major misconceptions is that they're sort of belittling the individual now, because we know we have 7 billion people on the planet. We have all type of specialists running in each field, in the field of science, agriculture, education. So we tend to think of ourselves as being insignificant, where in reality, it's exactly the opposite. There's so much creative potential in each individual. It's mind-boggling. Because when you look at all the major changes in civilization, unfortunately, some of them have been negative, but a lot of these changes have come from one individual. It only takes one person to start to really spark a chain reaction. So we should try to get out of that mindset of, I'm so insignificant because I'm only one person. No, the creativity that Ken just mentioned is vast, and we're just barely tapping into that potential. But it only takes one individual to make or to initiate that major change. So this is why I think the young people are very vital now, because they don't have as much programming and conditioning to deal with as some of us from the old school, right? So their minds are open. So they're going to actually explode in terms of the creative potential of human consciousness. So a lot of our talks, and Ken I've mentioned, is that hopefully we can impart this knowledge as well as give encouragement to those people who are creative. Go with it 100%. Be able to change and take control of your awareness, and know that you can make a major change not only in yourself, but also in your immediate environment. And people will be receptive to that change that you initiate. Believe me, people are really hungry for positive change now. As Ken just mentioned, how many times do we have to stay in this loop, destructive loop of repeating all of our mistakes? So it's time now to make that major leap to a higher plane, a higher way of thinking. So people are very hungry for, for higher knowledge now.
Yeah, that's great. That was perfect. What's popping in my intuitive framework right now is so we're talking about all this, and we're talking about mass levels of suffering, and we're talking about violence coming from fear. We're talking about, how about this simple string? You're suffering. More often than not, in my investigations, for me, the suffering is related to some kind of fear of something. It can be fear of losing a relationship, a job, my health. It can be all kinds of things, but it's still suffering based on a fear of something. Okay. Now this ties into, well, why do we keep repeating history? And is there so much violence? And well, wait a minute, you guys are trying to connect all this to study of martial arts, which is still based on the idea of death and combat. And I go, yes, but the deal there is the training is learning to work with high intensity levels of fear. Okay. And fear is fear, fearful situations of any kind. What's more fearful to a lot of people than either dying of some horrible, nasty, painful disease that drags on forever and ever, or at the hands of another human being wielding a knife or a gun or whatever? It's just a study in how to deal with fear, learn how to have self-control in those situations and survive, and then to evolve from your experience. Okay. So that being said, I just felt I had to step back a minute and get folks to understand how the practice of dealing with violent situations can be a very intense, mind-opening and very evolutionary process in making you move out of that paradigm, okay, and shift into one whereby all your experiences with that kind of training and what you put yourself through. Stan and I just had this conversation at dinner last week. What eventually tends to happen is all the things that you learn about how you can be harmed by another human or groups of humans, and the things that happen to your body and your emotions as you go through that process, tend to lead you to wanting to eradicate those various forms of suffering. So then, if you're following the evolution or the process, you start naturally finding yourself moving into areas where, well, how do I, on the physical level, how do I fix my body boo-boos from all the punches and the training knives I've been poked with, and the hard throws and falls I've taken, and being knocked out a few times, and maybe even having some minor concussions. I know I had ribs cracked and imploded moving toward my ribs at one point. Yeah, all kinds of crazy stuff. So a lot of times the process is you start learning, like, I got to learn how to heal myself. Well, in the process of training with people, there's a camaraderie that develops. The camaraderie is, you learn to cherish your training partners. Without them, you don't have squat. So even guys that come into training and they have big egos and they're really competitive and they're really out to just learn how to hurt people in better ways, start realizing that, somebody half my size and even of the opposite so-called weaker sex can clean my clock when they have that experience. At least from one perspective, they can learn how to respect people and come into respect for others through the back. I'll call that coming in through the back door where it wasn't intentional. This starts to manifest and build itself in layers and layers and layers and layers. The more you go at this, the more you realize that any human can hurt another human. There's different ways to do it. It doesn't, if you're smart, you don't have to stand there and deal with their strength one-on-one. Stand across the street with a freaking hunting rifle with the scope and blow their damn brains out. You can be 8 years old and do that to Bruce Lee. It wouldn't matter. Okay. So you start to think on all these levels, and this is the example I'm trying to get, how we're creating suffering for ourselves and others by having this intense competitive thing that comes from fear. I have to be better than you. I have to be stronger than you. Most of our athletic programs instill this in people. You know what? I recently heard of a really cool school. I think it might be over in Illinois, where they caught on to this, and they decided that the way they're going to teach their kids how to play soccer, there's no scoring and there's no competition. I haven't looked at the whole model yet on exactly how this works, but they arrange things in such a way that what the kids end up trying to do is work together as a cooperative group to attain a goal. It was something like that. The idea of getting the ball through the goalpost was an effort in cooperative movement. I'm not paying justice to this thing. I have to go find this again. I stumbled on it and had to run out the door, but just showing that shift in the change in mentality. Now, just look at what that says. People's consciousness opening up, right? Okay. Because what they're noticing is we make these kids too competitive, right? They want to beat the other guy. They want to be stronger than the other guy. They want to be stronger than the other team. This is still based on the basic models of fear and aggression, okay, or violent aggression, okay? So we have to look at how the suffering is created from all these crazy different angles, and how sometimes by immersion, right, in the core, most powerful version of dealing with fear and aggression and violence is to go right into a personal study of it. And this is what we've done with the whole martial art model is as an impetus, which has led us so far beyond that model that now here we are talking about ways to use that and other methods to just study that all of this stuff boils down to suffering. The suffering that we create. How about this? If the levels of suffering that you're creating for yourself are so high, what do you tend to project outward? You project your own suffering onto other people. And the ones you do it to the most are the ones you're the closest to, typically. This is one of the reasons that traditional marriages fail these days more than other traditional families fail more. They're teaching and instilling their own suffering on others, and they're creating the suffering. See, and it's a huge loop, and it's a huge feedback loop. Stan, we're talking about on the mass level of wars and all the wacky stuff going on, but it starts in the mini collective, which is right there in your own family and your own friendships and your own organizations. So this is what we have to look at. We have to see how connected all this stuff is. All these levels of suffering are connected to our own. Stan brought it up. It starts right here. We have to take responsibility for it, right? Because we have to withdraw from all that. If you can't get yourself together and straighten out, you can't help anybody else. You might think you are, but think of the messages, think of the negative stuff that you can be programming them with, thinking you're helping them, and it's almost like you're pouring internal kerosene on their internal frames of suffering by even just the way you come at it. So you got to do it for you first.
Yeah, to really summarize this talk is really challenging because this is the type of topic that branches out to so many different components.
Yeah.
But if we were to try to maybe summarize, it does start with sort of the man in the mirror effect. And that is, if we want to implement change, we have to start with ourselves. And so we have to be aware of how we are and also why we are creating our own suffering, our own pain. And we mentioned at the last session is that, a lot of the pain and suffering that we endure as a human is part of our growth cycle. So it's to be taken for granted in the sense that we're going to have disappointments, frustrations, letdowns, and so forth. That's just a part of learning and a part of our evolutionary path. But when we get stagnant when we get caught in that pain, whether it's physical or emotional, then that's what really creates that sense of suffering, or that component of suffering that we have to find a way to resolve. And sometimes we go through cycles where, okay, you'll make small, mistakes and so forth, and you're able to handle it, and then it'll lead us into sort of like a downward spiral, and we'll have sort of a depression for maybe a week or a month or whatever. Those cycles, and we come out of it, but we have to be aware of these cycles. So again, this is why I mentioned self-image. If you have a positive self-image of who you are and what you want to do in your life, then that's going to be a very strong and stable anchor for you to be able to navigate through your learning curve. If you have a negative, whether you're creating it or you're letting it come in and create it for you from the outside, then you're going to have these deep slopes where sometimes you can fall into a depression where you cannot come up again. So we see that in society. So I think, again, we contemplate, and as we mentioned before, we do our own personal spiritual psychic research and find out how and why we are creating what we're creating, be it also positive and also negative, because you just can't look at the suffering. You have to also look at the joy, because a lot of times it's the size of the same coin. Okay, so we want to focus on that positive. We want to focus on creating joy.
You know why I'm laughing? It just hit me, man. It was like a pure energy bolt that just shot from your forehead to mine, which is I have a very strong feeling that our next subject should be joy, in creating joy in your life.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, we don't need to keep it all gloom and doom, which is not really what we're talking about anyway. And I think you got that, but because actually, if we focus on that subject next time, you'll see how that comes out of this process, or how that can come out of this process, and then it gives extreme credence to what Stan just said. Is it's your own process work that will move you to a different place and take you beyond all that suffering, however it comes at you. So that's what I'm suggesting, Stan, for the next time. And these things like just happened when I got going, is there's crisscrosses, but they're all connected. You can still see that they're all connected. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff here we can talk about. We both have been through a lot, and we're both in our 60s now, and we're still debonair, sexy guys, but we are in our 60s. And see, there's positive self-image regardless of this ugly mug you see here staring at you.
Okay.
All right, so I guess it's time to wrap it up. We have these things set for an hour. I know we've laid a lot of stuff out there. We don't want to just keep yakking on and on. So Stan, unless you have another finishing thought, I'm ready to end it if you are. And then, hey guys, figure we're always trying to do this a month from now. Stan and I don't know, Stan, what do you think? How many more talks you think we need to do before we can start inviting people to join us live? What's your intuition on that?
Between one or two, possibly just one.
Yeah.
Because I think, we're stabilizing a good, format.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. So, okay. So guys, stay tuned for next time. In about, like I said, we try to be right at about 30 days on a Sunday morning, 11 to 12. Next topic will be joy and creating yours in your life. And we'll just plan to see you next time. And then, like Stan said, probably the time after, we'll go ahead. I'll throw some stuff up on Facebook. He will too, hopefully. So folks that are kind of following us will know that when it's going to be, so they'll be able to join us. And we'll try to get the exact date out, like at least a week ahead of time, if not sooner.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, folks. Signing off.
All right. Take care.